A very good afternoon to both of you, and really good to have you with us on the Daytime Update. Perhaps let me start with you, Judi. If you could give us an outline as to how the tourism sector and specifically your businesses have started to recover with the easing of lockdowns. Have you started seeing any real progress there?
I'd like to start off by saying that without livelihoods, without jobs, there is no life. And Tourvest, which is Southern Africa's largest integrated tourism entity, has felt the impact of COVID in the most horrific ways. I cannot begin to share with you the horror of what is happening in our sector. We have employed over 5,000 people in our corporation or in our business. And it started off with a hard lockdown where, of course, you didn't feel the impact. But across our value chain, we operate in 5 areas of the tourism value chain. It is a bloodbath. It is Armageddon. It is the suffering that our employees are feeling. I cannot share with you and your audience more. That 80% of the tourism sector relies on SMMEs, relies on women. And these are the women and our informal economies, the people that have been most affected by COVID. And any further restrictions or curtailment or soft lockdowns will have an increased disastrous effect on South Africa and South African society.
Jifiwa, if you could bring us into confidence as to the nature of conversations that have been happening between the tourism business of South Africa as well as other stakeholders in the tourism sector with government, as deliberations are being made on how to move forward, how to balance the lives and livelihoods, so to speak.
Look, thanks for having me. I think we've been having lots of conversation, and there are a few simple facts. Number one, we cannot afford to go back into hard lockdown where we have restrictions on the movement of people that are traveling to various areas for tourism purposes. If we do that, we will finish off what's left of tourism. You heard from Judi in terms of how companies are suffering, and more importantly, the employees who have worked for us for many years. So the conversation that we've been having is simply that we cannot afford any restriction, we cannot afford any more hard lockdown. And if we are to have restrictions, they have to be smart, they have to be targeted, it has to be a certain area. We cannot have a blanket approach in this. We cannot afford to shut down the country, and surely the fiscals cannot be able to respond to another, lockdown. We don't have UIF tiers program to support the employees, so anything that will take away the little income that we're making is just going to kill off what's left of tourism.
And Judi, how would these localized lockdowns that are being spoken of, how would they affect international tourism and the international traveler?
Any form of lockdown is going to have a negative impact in terms of the brand of SA as a tourist destination. But what is very important to understand is that if you look at, you need to understand the structure of the tourism economy and how women and the informal sector in the main is your supply chain. So take a simple item that you buy in a shop. When tourists travel, they eat and they shop. So if we have lockdowns, it means the poorest of our workers in the tourism sector, the cleaners, the chefs, the cooks, the women who turn the beds up, turn the beds down, the people who make the sausages on the braai, the people who serve you, that bring you your food, that let you into a park, that lets you out of a park. So that segment of South African society, the most vulnerable, they are the hardest hit because in our communities, in our streets, people are not able to move, which means they cannot get to work. You know, the economy is a living organism. It moves from the street corners into corporate boardrooms. So at the moment, we are really relying on domestic tourism to buffer the misery and the suffering we are undergoing in the sector. And any attempt to curtail movement is going to wreak havoc that we cannot even begin to anticipate. These sound like words, but if you go to communities, where we have had to retrench people, where we've had to furlough people. It's not only that. At Tourvest, we offer bursary programs to our employees. The knock-on effect, it's like a deck of cards, a stack of dominoes just falling. And we have not begun to see the impact. So all we are requesting, as we are going to be addressed tonight, is that we move with extreme caution. We were promised that the lockdown was an opportunity to ensure that the health services were able to cope. And we have learned from the HIV and AIDS epidemic. We know what that did to brand SA as a tourism destination. And now we have COVID, that you must invest in your healthcare services because we actually have good recovery rates. We need to up our testing. But when people need treatment, the health services, especially in a province like the Eastern Cape, where I come from, at the moment, they're still intubating. And that was a protocol that was agreed upon was not the way to treat. So we understand the sense of panic. We understand the nervousness, but we need to be very cautious around how we are going to take food out of the mouths of the poorest of South Africans who work in the tourism industry.
Jifiwa, you mentioned a bit earlier on about the need for localized, restrictions and not a blanket restriction on the entire industry. Now, we know that the Western Cape is affected with the resurgence. We know that KwaZulu-Natal is also one of the provinces that has been earmarked for greater restrictions. But also, these are two of the provinces that enjoy quite a healthy tourism atmosphere, especially during the festive season. What type of recommendations would be made to the president on how best to deal with COVID-19 restrictions during these time in areas that are usually high traffic areas?
Yeah, look, I must emphasize that, the tourism industry and its value chain is not the source of infection. First of all, we don't have a lot of international tourists that are coming into the country. So we can count that out. We're still building up in terms of getting to the point where we'll have a lot more people coming into the country. The domestic travelers that are traveling to our establishments and going through the value chain, they are following the protocols, and we're making sure that we have de-risked the sector and people are able to travel and stay at accommodation facilities and do many other things without getting any infection. If there is any infection, it's minimal and we're not the super spreaders. So I think that's important to underline that the tourism value chain is not the source of infection. What we need to do is to figure out where the infections are coming from and deal with a particular area where the infection is coming from. I think that's important to deal with. Because if we just go and say, well, there's infection in Cape Town, where in Cape Town there is infection, how are we dealing with it? Is there community engagement? Are we doing awareness and many other things that are important for people to know what they need to do or continue to do to prevent the spread of the virus? So if there is anything that needs to be done, is that we need to up our game in terms of making sure that the communities are aware of the virus. They understand that level 1 doesn't mean that the virus is gone, and we make sure that whatever restrictions that we put are not harmful to the livelihood, as Judi have said. If we go with a blanket approach where we say restriction is a way to go, we know it's not a way to go. Look at how many people have lost their jobs, and look at the fact that we're still going through the same thing, resurgence. It means that education is key to making sure that people understand what they need to do. So if we are to have any restriction, of which for us as a tourism industry, we don't want any restriction. We've been closed for way too long. We've just opened. We're starting to rebuild. But if we are to have any restriction, they have to be smart. They have to be targeted to a specific area. They have to deal with the problem. But we have to make sure that the tourism value chain remains open, because the source of infections are not coming from the tourism value chain. We need to go to the specific places where these things are coming from. Number 2, we need to make sure that our vaccination regime is clear, because many countries are vaccinating at the moment or planning to start vaccination. What is going on with that within our country? So we need to get to a point where we start to say, we're going to start vaccinating at this specific period, because if we don't have the vaccination regime, we're going to have this problem of closing and restriction. We close here, we go to the next one, we close. We're going to always close because we don't have awareness and we don't have the vaccination regime. So those are the type of things that we need to be thinking about, but not a blanket approach of closing out, the industry or making sure that people are not traveling around. We need domestic tourism to continue. We need international tourists to come into the country. We need to sustain the very jobs we have and the few people that we're still hiring. And hopefully soon we'll get those that are sitting at home to come back to work.
And I guess we'll leave it at that for this afternoon. Thank you so much to both of you for your insights as we await the presidential address, which is due at 8 p.m. tonight. How will his address affect the tourism industry? That was Judi Nwokedi, the CEO of Tourvest, as well as Chifiwa Chivenga, CEO of Tourism Business Council of South Africa.